Well, welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Karthik Nachiappan. I'm a fellow here at the Institute, and it's my great pleasure to be joined by two colleagues and experts, Dr. Constantino Xavier and Dr. Pooja Ramamurthi, respectively Senior Fellow and Fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi. CSEP and ISAS are now currently working on a joint project focusing on India-China climate and energy cooperation to better understand and map how both countries can work together to decarbonize and how this cooperation can manifest in areas like trade, investment, technology, and diplomacy. Both India and China are currently executing ambitious energy transitions. China's is far ahead, but India possibly has more potential. So there could be ways where both countries can and should do things together. Besides potential, there's also an existential need for India. I think for India to grow its clean energy industry, it will face a challenge of rising dependence on China for key inputs and resources, which really makes decoupling of any sort untenable and also undesirable for actors engaged in India's own energy transition. So, in this situation, how can and how should both countries cooperate in the broad climate and energy space? Also, given the security issues and tensions and the mistrust that still exists between both countries today. So, we're going to be talking about the project, talking about these issues and where and how India and China can cooperate in terms of energy and climate issues. Tino and Pooja, thank you so much for joining us. Pooja, let me go to you first. Please tell us how this project started. What's the core idea that led to better understanding and studying whether these two countries can work together on energy and climate issues?
Thank you so much for having us on this podcast to speak about this very exciting project that we are doing. So I think I'll actually take a step back to when Tino and you worked on your Tracks to Transition report, where we just started mapping the different ways in which India is engaging diplomatically at the global stage on climate change. And I think over there, I think one of the stark things that we saw was that India is not really engaging with China diplomatically, although it does have these strong trade linkages where a lot of its green trade happens with China, especially where it is importing a lot of goods components, which are needed for its own energy transition. And when you see that India has such a diverse climate engagement portfolio, but then one of its biggest actors is missing, then that was, I think, something that piqued our interest and, something that we realized we need to work on. As you said, and it is also as on an existential level, because the truth is that these are, the two of the world's largest emerging economies. Although, as you said, China is way ahead of the curve. At the same time, the way that India uses energy for its future growth will be key to limiting carbon emissions as well. So the choices that it makes now will be very globally relevant. And India's stances at global negotiations, climate negotiations, have always been important, but are also starting to be more important. So, I mean, it just made sense then to understand, okay, how are the two world's largest economies, who are quite important to the climate debate, how can they, or should they? So first is like, should they? And then, if they should, then how should they really engage on climate and energy issues? I think that is the core idea that we had. So within this, we first realized that India and China are already engaging in the past. Like they have engaged, since 1992, since Rio, there has been engagement. So one of the core ideas was to map past engagement and to see, what has happened in the past, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel when the geopolitical tensions between India and China get better, which they are, as we are seeing. So when we first started the project, when we started ideating, diplomatic engagement between the two countries was not that was negligible at that point. But as we have progressed in our work, we have simultaneously luckily seen that even the engagement between the two countries has now improved. So when this opening or this entry point does happen, the whole point of the project is to give a strategic framework on past experiences as well as given today's geopolitical context on what can be the strategic entry points for both countries, to kind of talk about climate and energy. And we also thought, being based in New Delhi, having a partner in Singapore with NUS, with ISAS, would be kind of a key third party who could kind of be a neutral ground when we kind of have these India and China conversations. So yeah, I think that's where it all started.
Pooja mentioned that things have gotten better between China and India today. Things have certainly been moving in a more positive direction, at least diplomatically. What's your sense on where China-India relations are right now? And how does that bilateral situation affect the potential for climate diplomacy?
Thanks, Karthik. I think, as you rightly point out, there's a probing, careful re-engagement between India and China. They are testing the waters after 10 years of disengagement or turbulent waters and confrontation, even in bilateral relations. So that, I think, at least opens up a window of opportunity to talk more on climate, energy, and the long-term green transition agenda for both countries. So that's the broader context, at least opens up the possibility. Second, as a function of that, Karthik, there's a big debate here in India on what the terms of that engagement should be. It can't be a total decoupling, which India has experimented with in the past few years, nor can it be, of course, a blind engagement and let's do all together and cooperate. The big debate, I think, that we're seeing play out here in India is across government, across different industries and different levels of industry, large, small, trading, investment, intensive sectors that are discussing where the greatest opportunities, of course, are for India to engage China, and where the greatest risks are, and to set up systems that obviously minimize risks of Chinese predominance or security risks, depending on who you speak to, and where the greatest opportunities are for India's own economic trajectory and India's own green agenda. And that, I think, then leads you to not necessarily a direct discussion on climate between India and China. It may be evolving, let's see, over the next few months. But what we see already is that climate is showing up in sectors of tentative engagement between India and China. So climate and energy are now embedded in several other discussions on the terms of engagement between India and China, for example, on technology, finance, investments, supply chains. That, again, I think, explain, I hope, also the origin, as Pooja mentioned, and the relevance of our project, that we need to look exactly where can climate and energy figure in bilateral relationships. And that most recently has been quite apparent in the issue of light rare earth magnets and the critical minerals between Chinese predominance in terms of processing and India's requirement and even dependence on these. You'll know that China restricted earlier this year these exports. But over the last few days, we're seeing India and China actually discussing now the terms of those imports. China, of course, having an interest in restricting re-export or imposing export controls on India. And India also, of course, realizing that the imports of those Chinese light rare earth magnets come with certain restrictions. And I think India and China, as we speak, are also engaging on this issue indirectly. And that's, I think, opening up a new window of opportunity to talk about climate and energy more broadly between both countries.
Great, thanks. Pooja, I want to come back to you, and I'm wondering, and I should have asked this earlier, but can you define energy and cooperation in this context for us? Specifically, what kinds of issues feature here? I mentioned a few in my opening remarks, like trade, investment, but I'm guessing, as Tino just mentioned, it goes to other areas like rare earths and critical minerals, and probably issues like steel, which are being greened right now. So how far does this space go, and how does this focus, as the climate space ostensibly expands, differ from what these countries have done in the past?
So the climate and energy space, clean energy space is vast. I mean, if you see like what we have done, the mapping, the previous engagement from 1992 onwards, since the Rio summit, I think you'll see that actually I think, and one of the conclusions of our project is that the engagement was too vast and broad with not enough narrow focus. So you can start from energy efficiency, of course, to clean energy, to setting standards and regulations. You have green taxonomies. You have, of course, you have the industrial aspects, as you mentioned, of steel, of green steel and cement. You have electric vehicles, batteries, storage. So it can go on and on and on. But this is also only on the mitigation side. So this is your lowering carbon emission side. And now for all of that, of course, you need the supply chains and the rare earths to kind of meet those needs for all these things I was speaking about. But one thing that I should have touched upon earlier as well is you also have the climate adaptation part as well, right? Like you have both the countries have shared ecosystems as well. They are both in regions that are very vulnerable to climate change. So you are going to see increased flooding, heat waves within their shared ecosystems as well. In the Himalayas, you're going to see one of the major tipping points with the melting of glaciers. So these are things also that it's important to understand how are both countries thinking to tackle, and even if not direct bilateral engagement, can there be more coordination within the region on how they can engage on these as well, right? So when you're talking about climate and energy, it is really a vast topic, but I think what is really important and what our project is trying to do is trying to see within this vast topic, what can you actually sectorally focus on and what can be your strategic entry points, right? So I think that is what is most important because, and then when you talk about what really is climate cooperation and clean energy, it could also be on which actors are involved. So it could be business to business, it could be government to government, it could be subnational, it could be civil society and academic institutions. So I think these are things that we want to explore a little bit to understand which are the optimal ways, and just kind of start engage and start understanding what can really be done within this really big space.
Great. And just to kind of add on to that, I think climate as we know it has also been fragmenting as an issue that's covered across a spate of domestic areas. And there are way more strategic entry points, as Pooja mentioned, and more actors beyond just government. And I think this is a big change in the bilateral climate relationship between both countries. And historically, China and India have actually worked together through coalitions from the 1990s. But that cooperation has largely been political and normative, right? It's on to advance common positions on equity, on finance, on differentiated responsibilities at global climate negotiations. I think the last few years, even as border tensions have grown since 2020, I think what we have seen is that climate cooperation, as it's expanded in different areas, has not collapsed. And even at COP27 and COP28, I think India and China aligned on resisting stronger obligations to phase down all fossil fuels. So there are areas both multilaterally and domestically that both countries can do. And I wanted to just move to that to ask Tino, besides bilateral cooperation, can these two countries now work multilaterally, but also work beyond the multilateral space together in regions like South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa? And I wanted to just flag a report that you just released recently, which covers China's role in South Asia and how it's engaged different governments in different areas. So, what's your sense on whether these two countries can do more together within the broader region?
Thanks, Karthik. Let me just start on beyond the region and the multilateral. Let me just emphasize the importance of the bilateral engagement. So I think any type of India-China climate and energy dialogue that we can find at the regional level and at the multilateral level hinges first on a healthy bilateral engagement that has been missing, a dialogue that is maybe a precondition, even, I'd say, a bilateral dialogue for alignment at various other levels, whether regional or multilateral. So that's slowly in process as we speak, as I mentioned before. It's driven by government, by industry, by academia, as Pooja mentioned. There's many levels and actors in India that are beginning to think how to re-engage with China on these climate and energy issues, directly or indirectly. So that's the first point I want to make. I think before we even think about regional multilateral, the bilateral is fundamental. The second one is that there's some obstacles and there's some opportunities. Both again at the regional level, let's say India and China looking at Southeast Asia, thinking about cooperation across the global south in developing technologies and exporting or adapting technologies to global south countries and showing up as climate players in third spaces together. I think the obstacles are one that we often forget, but China has taken off in more than one way over the last 10, 20 years. The asymmetry with India is becoming starker. And in particular, in this sector, Chinese emissions today are 4 times higher than India's, which puts China often closer to the global north than to the global south and explains a very different Chinese climate diplomacy and green foreign policy and agenda than that of India's. So these are today more different players at the multilateral and international level than they were 10 years ago. Second, that manifests, I think, and shows in other regional and sectoral initiatives that has been creating, where China has been absent from. I'm thinking of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the International Solar Alliance. These are two initiatives that are multi-minilateral, however you want to call them, but have been driven and pushed by India and some of its partner countries, including France. But China is manifestly absent from these, and India has not made plays, so still not made any indication that it would like China to be an equal partner and player within these two regional, sectoral, minilateral institutions. Now, the good news, maybe, let me end on that, is that India and China are still part of what still is the COP conference system under the UN, where they have shown overlaps in position and they remain, in particular again on adaptation, as Pooja was mentioning before. Second, they are part also of other regional and sectoral organizations, such as the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, for example. They're both members of those organizations. So there are touch points and opportunities for more dialogue and discussion there. And finally, maybe coming to your main point there, Karthik, on regional organizations, I think in Southeast Asia in particular, if we see what ASEAN has been achieving in terms of grid connectivity and joint energy policies across the Southeast Asian and ASEAN region, given that this is a joint neighborhood and joint neighboring region for both India and China, maybe there's some potential there for India and China to begin sort of a tripartite dialogue and see how they can jointly deploy solutions for ASEAN's decarbonization agenda.
And let's also not forget that China is still not a member of the International Solar Alliance, despite being one of the world's largest producers of solar technologies. So there is scope for India and China to do more on issues like this, two frameworks that do exist today. Pooja, I want to come back, talk a little bit about the mechanics of India-China climate cooperation. Will I think ultimately come down to figuring out and balancing the trade-offs between economics and security, right? I think China now is the dominant actor and player in green technologies. They are increasingly positioning themselves as the foremost clean tech supplier, whether it's solar, EVs, batteries, they dominate. India is positioning itself as a clean tech manufacturer and a green development hub, which continues to be wary of China's dominance in this space and wary of becoming dependent on China. So, how can India then advance its own objectives and interests without not just without direct engagement with China, but given where the security concerns are? How do you balance both of that for India?
Well, that's a pretty complex question, because I think the dependency is already there. Like if you see the recent rare earth magnet curve, which which has all been in the news, and as Tino says, in the past few days there has been some conversation about that opening up. But the truth is that when that happened, it was a really big blow to the Indian EV industry. So, for example, India has a goal of 30% electric vehicle penetration by 2030, which is in the next 5 years. But when that rare earth magnet curve came in, there was actually talk within the automobile industry to maybe slow down on their production of EVs, because they wouldn't be able to roll out those many EVs without these key rare earth magnets. So you already see, and this is, as someone who works on climate, that, if these geopolitical issues or these security issues, these national security issues are not solved, then there will be an actual repercussion to how India's energy transition goes ahead. I'm not saying it'll totally stop. What I'm saying is that there might have to be some strategic rethinking, and it might slow down till they find technology alternatives. So in that sense, I would say we're already in a situation of, I mean, the dependency is a word, but yeah, we're already very interlinked with their supply chains. So very realistically, if you see, I mean, a lot of studies which have come out recently on this resilience, one by UCSD, one by Johns Hopkins, and our work as well. In the short and medium term, India is going to continue to be majorly dependent on China, like industries. And probably in the long term as well, some amount will come from China, but the best we can do is put in place diversification strategies, which India has done successfully in the oil and gas industry as well. Like we have put in diversification strategies in our other sectors. So I think we can. I mean, we are already putting in place. Like if we see, we are part of the mineral security partnerships. We are trying to, build more engagements with the EU. We're trying now more and also to engage with Africa and Latin America as well on the critical minerals. So if you see, we're already putting in a lot of these diversification strategies. And I think that'll be our best bet. So if we want to balance our engagement with China, to not have a total 100% dependency, but to still continue to engage, then I think, that would be our best bet. But at the end of the day, we need to continue a conversation with China as well, so we need to do both at the same time. And I think that kind of balancing act between ensuring that we are able to build our own technical capacity, our own manufacturing capability, and as well as securing our own supply chains, while at the same time engaging with China, will be quite important, because at the same time China, through their FDI and through, if we have more strategic trade agreements, can also help us in joint ventures like what they did with the JSW, with Jindal Steelworks, and with Morris Garage, which kind of now are rolling out EVs, which is I think now the second fastest growing EV manufacturer within India. So you can see that such joint ventures are possible between Chinese and Indian industry, which then also ensures that we have tech transfer and capacity within the country itself. So I think if more of these kind of strategic joint ventures can also happen with China, which helps India bring up its own manufacturing base, but that has also been a little bit of contention because there has been talk that China itself is trying to kind of um, be cautious with the amount of capacity that it builds within India as well, because it doesn't, because of the competitive angle. So, how we can find strategic entry points within this contestation and competition, I think, that is really important for us to understand. And this balancing act between engaging strategically with China, but also diversifying with other partners, I think that will be key.
Are there any areas where India you think might have leverage?
I mean, at this point, I mean, as you said, it's not only India. I think a lot of the world, the entire world is kind of dependent on China. So I wouldn't say this is the only India specific problem that, I think if you see the US, EU, all of these countries, for their minerals, supply chains, etc., are don't have a leverage as such. But at the end of the day, I mean, from what I've been hearing internally in China, is there's a glut, right? There's a glut. There's overproduction of a lot of these materials. I think in Chinese industries within themselves are at kind of a price war that these clean energy and green tech have become so cheap that they now need to find a market. So I think I don't think China can also afford to completely disengage with India as well in that sense, because there is still an economic motive on the Chinese part as well. But I say a leverage or an upper hand at this moment. I mean, I'll give it to Tino. I don't know what he thinks, but at least in the green energy space, I don't see so. I don't think so. Yeah.
Bettina, I want to come back to you to finish. Pooja talked about the short term and the long term. What's your sense on how this nascent cooperation, which is now emerging between both countries on this issue, will play out, given, as we mentioned before, the broader geopolitical and geoeconomic conditions, China's own strengths in this area, and what they've done with those strengths, potentially weaponizing it in their own interest. Are you optimistic or sanguine about how this dimension of energy and climate cooperation will play out between both countries over the short and medium term?
I guess a mix of two of my favorite approaches, which is optimism and realism. So if you want cautious optimism, in 4 points, I take one, building on what Pooja just mentioned in answer to your googly there on leverage. Does India have leverage? I think on this one, we have to defer to China. The answer is in China, and it's a big debate among the sinologists and experts on China. They're trying to decipher how China is looking at India and at the market in India. Version A, the market offers opportunities, as Pooja mentioned, that the Chinese companies want to enter and want to engage with. In that case, yes, India has leverage. There's a second school of thought that Chinese decision makers these days are not interested so much, or there's not as much of a leverage in the Indian market. They see it as a competition, in that sense, as an economic threat in the future, and therefore will be more cautious about sharing technology, investing, etc., in the climate and energy space in India. Second point is on geopolitics and security. I think if we look at this only from a geopolitical and security perspective, or use these words loosely, I think they don't help us to understand India's China policy. Actually, I think most of this is about the terms of interdependence, about the economic growth agendas, the trade and industrial strategies that both countries are pursuing that are not always aligned. And therefore, climate and energy becomes a function of that discussion. So yes, border issues matter, military issues matter, the geopolitical place that both countries will have. They're all important, but they're actually, I think, a symptom of a deeper discussion, which is both countries need to perform in terms of the developmental and growth agenda, and climate and energy becomes coupled with that. Third, I'm very realistic in terms of the sense that, listen, it can't get worse, Karthik. That's the good news between India and China in terms of climate and energy. And I would say there's a high probability that it will get better, as I mentioned before. So if you are interested in the net zero agenda and making it happen as soon as possible, or whatever's left of that, I think this is good news, that India and China cooperation is not necessary for the success of the global agenda, but it's something that can accelerate and facilitate that objective, and bring it closer rather than making it more difficult and more distant. And finally, in other good news, and maybe the final good news, since you're pushing me on the optimism, we're seeing, Karthik, and you and I have done the work that Pooja has mentioned before, we're all working in this paradigm, is that this is now a wider playing field, right? This is not anymore a state-centric affair of international organizations and multilateralism. This is a wider and therefore also more complex playing field. Nothing wrong with more complexity. It can actually be good, because now we have various new actors emerging in new formats that are thinking about the climate agenda. And that means, in two examples here in India, in the mapping that we've been doing, the private sector and industry, right? You want to attract foreign investment today. You need to be worried about CBAM. You need to be worried about taxonomies. You need to be worried about finance and capital that is green and recognized and certified in green ways internationally. So you need to play ball in mechanisms that are shaping those rules, right? If you're even the private sector here in India. And the second example is regional states and even cities today, right? I think there are at least 2 Indian cities, if I'm not wrong, that are part of the C40 conglomerate of global cities that are part of the larger COP discussions on how to connect urbanization to climate transition. And regional states in India also are developing their own systems, their own thinking, their own outreach internationally, and their own regional state climate agendas that I think are very interesting, fertile ground for India to play a more important role, including with China, also at the subnational level.
Great. Thank you so much, Tino, and thank you, Pooja. In terms of the future, what I can say is that this project between CSEP and ISAS, through workshops and more research, will try to answer some of the questions that we've posed here by understanding how this cooperation unfolds between China and India. So thank you both for joining us, and thank you all for listening to another episode of South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at isas.nus.edu.sg, and can also get updates on our research and publications through social media on X, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.